You may notice that Anne is not Dorothy. Dorothy is not feeling well, so we keep Dorothy in our prayers. And Anne has always agreed that at the last minute, if someone is not feeling well and they are scheduled to do something, she will always, in a pinch, help us out. So we appreciate that. And that, she tells me, goes for me as well if I'm ever sick. So you can look forward to Anne preaching. She'd appreciate that. Can you imagine 9 o'clock in the morning? Hi, Anne. You're on. This Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, Bethany will have our second annual Blue Christmas service. And for those who are relatively new to Bethany, it will be in the chapel. I'm pointing, but you can take a look as you go. If you go into the fellowship hall following the service for some time to be in community, you can stop in and look in the chapel. It won't look quite that way on Wednesday, but we at Bethany are offering this. Now, in many United churches for several years, this has been an ongoing tradition. But we're offering it, as I say, for the second time. It is, for some people, a kind of a new experience to go to a service in Christmas where the tone is a little bit more reflective, and it's not quite, how do I put this? The atmosphere, while joyful, is not entirely given over to ecstatic, Jesus has come, let's go home and open our presents, and so on. And the reason for that is we acknowledge that during this time of year, while many are excited for all the things that Christmas brings, right? The smells, the presents, the scenery, the reconnecting with friends and family, the sense that Jesus came for us, with us, in that wonderful story in the manger. All of those things bring us joy. But for many people, there are other reasons why this time of year is difficult. Yeah? So the one that is the obvious one, obviously, is grief. Right? That's the big one, the elephant in the room. When people are acknowledging their feelings of sadness and loss and hurt. Because not all loss has to do with death, right? Some families are not together at Christmas for other reasons, right? And we tend, obviously, to talk about family in very holy terms, but not all families are in that place, yes? And during this time of year, when a person who may or may not be engaged in a close relationship with a family may look at all of these cherub-looking children and partners, parents, and grandparents and say, why not me? And also, this is a time of year when persons who are economically not able to afford all of the things that many of us take for granted, look at others and say, why not me? Yeah? And for many people, this can be a time of year where feelings of depression, deep sadness, rise. The days are shorter and there's more darkness, and that can trigger a lot of people. So we acknowledge all of that at the Blue Christmas service. And I want to assure anyone who goes, because I've already had this question, look, I'm not going to go to a service where I'm feeling low and feel lower, right? You ever had that? Yeah. I remember in one of my pastoral listening classes at AST when I was taking the class, one of the techniques of being with people who are in deep sorrow is to repeat to them like what they're feeling, to acknowledge their feelings. And so you'd be in one-on-one conversation and someone would say, I'm really feeling miserable, right? And then someone who's very empathetic would say, you're really feeling miserable. And that can be a sign of good listening. But if all we do is mirror that, guess what? At the end of the day, the person says, boy, do I ever feel miserable. And so there is within that service, in addition to the acknowledgement of the feelings, there is the sense that in the midst of this sadness, there is a light. There is joy. Not joy and light that completely and totally envelop the sadness. There will always be sadness and darkness. It's part of our human condition. But we can, in the midst of the darkness and the sadness, see that there is light as well. One of the expressions that my daughter has been teaching Kim and I is, you know, Dad, Mom, two opposite things can both be true. You ever heard that? In other words, you can be in a moment where you feel sadness and see joy. You can be sad and at some point in your sadness see the revealed joy that's in your midst. It can be both. You can hold both. And one of the great challenges for ministers is that we are constantly with people who are feeling great joy and great sadness. And sometimes those experiences can be day by day. I can be in my office and someone can drop in and share with me some very difficult news and sit in my office with me and cry and be deeply despairing. And the next day or two, come in my office and tell me something incredible and wonderful has happened. And my way of being with others is to try to acknowledge what God is doing. That in the midst of the sadness, there has opened up great joy. And so our text this morning is perfect for this sense of joy in the midst of sadness. It's perfect. It's from Isaiah, and it uses the land as an example of how God works to bring moments of joy in the midst of sadness. And the description is a desert where a beautiful crocus and beautiful blossoms come. And so I think all of us can imagine dry, arid land, and in the midst of it, something beautiful, green, red, abundant in color coming up. And what we see in that image is both. We see the dry, arid land, and we see the lush joy. And we hold in our visual both. We see both. We acknowledge both. And if you were to read Isaiah 34 and then Isaiah 35, you would get a real strong sense with words of what that picture in our mind means. There is a complicated relationship, and most church scholars have not been able to determine what Edom, E-D-O-M, has done to Israel that has brought forth these feelings of anger and resentment and pain. But something has happened because Israel and the people are feeling toward Edom not good thoughts. And as a result of that, they call on God for what they call revenge. But if you unpack what that word means, it really, a better word in the translation is advocacy, rescue. In other words, this notion that God would not let Israel go, that Israel and the people of God would not be abandoned in the midst of whatever suffering they were going through at the hands of Edom. And so there would be in this dry, arid land color and beauty and growth. I want to give you a couple of examples of where God can often bring to us in our dry, arid places, in our sadness, beauty and joy and hope. The first one, some of you know, early in weekday mornings, I do a little bit of contract work for the Department of Community Services at food banks in Dartmouth. And you're all having your morning tea. I'm somewhere in a food bank in Dartmouth talking to people. And on this past Wednesday morning, I was in a church. And the minister at that church, who is filling in while they're looking for a new minister, looked out at this sea of clients, because at this time of year, the food bank clients know that the food banks will be closed over the 2 weeks between Christmas and early January. And so they come for, in large numbers, for groceries that will sustain them over the holidays. So it's a very, very large crowd. And when you're going through Christmas in the midst of deep poverty, the whole season is complicated. And so this minister looked out and she said to the people, what I am trying to do with the congregation over the season of Advent, I want to do with you as well, which is, I am asking you to go to the back of the hall, and you will find pieces of broken pottery and broken glass. And I would like you to insert them into a large star. And once that is complete, we will hold the star through the Christmas season to remind us that in the midst of our brokenness, there are pieces of glass and pottery that come together to form a vessel of hope and something of beauty. And I thought to myself, God can speak through our brokenness and find ways to bring something beautiful in the midst of despair. Another story I want to share with you that I experienced last year during Advent, but I held this story because I knew it was something I wanted to share with you. Someone in my family has a loved one living with Alzheimer's. And this person visits her mother regularly. And her mother can become very anxious. And so one day, this woman took her mother out for an appointment, and then back to the place where she lives, not her home where she lived, but in a enhanced care facility. And the woman said, I don't want to go in there. That's not where I want to go. I want to go home. And there ensued a very difficult conversation. And many of you may have already been in that conversation. But here's what I want to tell you. In the midst of that very profound, arid, dark, despairing place, the first thing that happened is the woman in charge of the entire facility came down from her office, assured that she could fix the situation. She told the daughter, I've got this. And she went toward her mother and said, please come into your home. And I will not repeat what the woman said. It's not for church. Let's just say that language was still very much in her capacity. So that didn't work. And then a variety of staff members came down to try to bring this woman back into the facility. It didn't work. She began to cry, the daughter. What to do? And out of the blue, woman in a hijab, Muslim, who had recently been hired as a personal care worker, had somehow formed a bond with the mother. And she came down, she called the woman by her name. And she said, "Let's go upstairs and share a cup of tea." And the mother said, "Yes." She got up and they went up to the room. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that that story would be happening right there? And the daughter, in the midst of her despair and her pain, saw something. What she saw was a deep bond between two people born in completely different countries, belonging to different religions, but worshiping the same God. And the connection was so profound that she called this woman by name, and she leapt and went up. Does that take the sadness away? No. But does that reveal a joy in the midst of the sadness? Yes. And the final thing I'll mention, Lucy and I and Kim went to Winnipeg a year or two ago for Lucy, one of her pieces of art won an award for reconciliation between Aboriginal people and Canada. And it had to do with survivors of residential schools, and Lucy had drawn something that somehow triggered some feeling of reconciliation, and so she was being acknowledged. But for the 3 days that we were in Winnipeg before she received the award, we spent every day in small groups with residential school survivors. And that was very, very painful. To hear stories of women and men who had all been taken from their birth families away to schools far, far away and taught that their language was not appropriate, that their religion was not appropriate. That was painful and hard. But in every case, and every story was different, every story was different. But there was one single element of those stories that were all the same. Every one of those people who talked to Kim, Lucy, and I said the same thing. For them to heal, to experience the joy of life and love, where God, their Creator, had spoken to them through this sadness, came on the land. Every one of them said that the way that they found their way back was walking and talking on the land. And it reminded me how many of us who live in developed countries and highly technological civilizations have often forgotten that one of the great sources of God's love and healing and joy in the midst of despair is the land. And if you've ever been in a place in your life where you are despairing and in darkness and feeling deep sadness and gone into a season of God's creation, whether that was the autumn or the winter or the spring or the summer, and you experience something of the water or the trees or the sun or the sky or the night or the morning or an animal, and you said, I am alive. I am filled with joy. In the midst of my sadness, there is a God who loves me and who loves others. Thanks be to God. May all of us, in the midst of whatever darkness and sadness overcome you, know, as Anne was reading, that our weak knees, our trembling voices, our spirit, all of these can be strengthened in the great love of God that comes and brings light and love, not that completely eradicates the human condition of sadness, but that offers an alternative and a balance to that sadness that reminds us that we are not alone. Amen.